We're very excited to have you here. Thank you again.
Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Jennifer, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for being here. Hold on, I just want to make my space here a little more workable. There we go. Okay. So, my name is Susan Goldfisher. I've been with the Division of Capital Asset Management and Maintenance for 21 years, hard to believe, but true. And I've been practicing construction-related law for well over 30 years. So I've been in this world for a long time. I also have some familiarity with goods and services procurements, but the construction and design is really what is the bulk of my work here. At DCAM, I wear many hats, but one of the most important ones, well, they're all important, is making sure that our contract procurements, our construction procurements in particular, and our design procurements are in compliance with the required laws, which, as many of you know, are voluminous, and that we are doing everything the way we're supposed to be doing it. And I'm involved both from the initial standard construction documents that we utilize through developing customized documents for each procurement. And then I get involved in a certain portion of our projects for all aspects throughout when there are disputes. First of all, I handle almost all the bid protest disputes, but after procurement, after contract signing, if there are issues and disputes, I get involved in those as well. We do close to $1 billion worth of construction and design work annually. And I think most of you are probably familiar with our agency, but we are the agency that handles the vast majority of the Commonwealth's major construction projects. And that is pretty much anything over $3 million that has structural or mechanical aspects to it. That being said, today what I'm going to cover is a lot. I will go through it as best I can. I will try to go fairly at a good clip. I want you to feel free, if I am moving on from one topic to another and there's something you're not clear about or you have a question about, I don't have a problem with you answering. Jennifer, can you just look for raised hands, because I can't see the gallery? So absolutely. If someone raises a hand, or if maybe they can just unmute themselves. If you want to unmute yourself with a question, that's fine. Either way. But I want to try to get through this, and it really is an overview, but there's no quick overview of this that doesn't have some detail to it. So hang in, and we'll go through it together. The most important thing I'm going to leave you with before I even start is what's on this slide, and it'll also be on the last slide. And that is, at the bottom, it says valuable resources. The Inspector General's office puts out a handbook called Designing and Constructing Public Facilities. It is, if you will, the procurement guidebook or Bible for reference materials for construction and design procurement. It's on their website. It is free. They reissue it every several years, and luckily, just this fall, the 2021 version is out, so it's very up to date right now. They also have a set of procurement charts that are a good at-a-glance product to look at. So that's another thing you might want to download, but that the handbook is readable both by people who want to know all the details of the law and people who have no background but are just trying to find their way and navigate it. So I strongly recommend that you keep that either on your desktop or on your bookcase, whichever way you save reference materials. So what I'm going to cover is some introduction and background, the role of owners, projects managers, designer selection, bidding thresholds, contractor certification, pre-qualification and CM at risk projects, emergency procurements, prevailing wage and bonding, access and opportunity, which is a very hot topic these days, and minority women workforce, competitive compliance specs, and I'll have Q&A at the end. The one thing I will ask you to do, though, is not to ask questions about a specific situation you're currently dealing with. during the presentation. I can take those at the end and everybody can hear the questions and answers if you're in the midst or something during the presentation, just if something isn't clear or you want clarification on something. I prefer those questions as we go so that we don't move on before everybody's clear on what I've just been talking about. So the background, back in the 1980s, there was a lot of fraud coming to light in public construction in Massachusetts. There were libraries designed and built that could not withstand the weight of the books. There were buildings that had been bid and designed that weren't complete. There were all kinds of problems with the services public awarding authorities were getting in Massachusetts, and something called the Ward Commission was formed. And you can still find on the internet the Ward Commission's report. It is volumes, but at the end of the day, it brought to light major fraud that was going on in the public construction procurement process in Massachusetts. Amongst that fraud was that for the predecessor agency of DCAM, when the agency was hiring designers, apparently the list of the applicants went over to whoever the governor's office was, and they were checking off the ones that were contributors to campaigns. And so we weren't getting the best designers, we were getting something else. And that's just one little example of the kinds of things that happened. So after the Ward Commission concluded, there was major overhaul in the construction procurement laws. Things like DCAM certification became required. They developed something called the Designer Selection Board so that the state didn't select its own designers anymore, and a bunch of other things. But that was really a pivotal point in Massachusetts. And the good news is it happened. And so we've got a much better quality of design and construction services for our public projects. The challenging thing about it is it means more rules and regulations and processes. Since the overhaul and since the initial construction changes, the big changes in 2004, there was the construction reform law. For those of you that have been around before, for the first time ever, municipal projects over a certain dollar threshold had to hire their owner project managers to help them, since many, especially smaller cities and towns, don't have in-house staff that have the kind of expertise to manage a designer or manage a contractor. Pre-qualification for subcontractors, pre-qualification came into effect for larger projects. Subcontractor certification was added to the certification process, and CM at risk became available for procurements. All of those things happened in 2005 when the 2004 law came into effect. The next, recent big change was the Municipal Modernization Act. That changed the thresholds. Two big changes there. Changed the thresholds for vertical and horizontal construction so they were consistent, so that if you had a horizontal project, you didn't have to worry about, now, what is it that I do for this park project? Because it was different from a building project. And we got a really neat opportunity to do smaller procurements using either the statewide trade person's contract or one that you may have in your own city or town. And also, and that's what the last bullet is, this ability to have blanket vendor project contracts for smaller contractors. So probably another important thing, because most of what I'm going to talk about today is the building construction, the laws that control how we procure and contract for our building construction projects. But I will talk a little about horizontal, but the focus is going to be building. And so people get really confused about what's a building project, what isn't a building project. So the definition in the statute, that chapter 14944A is the statute that tells us what the building construction procurement laws cover. They cover the construction, reconstruction, installation, demolition, maintenance, or repair of a building by a public agency. There are two other kinds of building projects that are covered by different laws, but they both reference back to portions of chapter 14944A through J. They are energy management services contracts that are under 25A, and modular building projects, which there's not a lot of those. But again, what is a building? It is a structure that has a roof and sides. It doesn't have to have electricity. It doesn't have to have plumbing. But if it has a roof and sides, if I will, walls in some way, it is considered a building, and it's subject to the set of laws we're going to review today. Notice, and this screws people up a lot, demolition. People think demolition, we're tearing it down, we're not building it. Demolition is covered by these laws. Maintenance, and this is the one that really screws people up. They think that if they have a company come in and just, check and maintain, let's say, the HVAC system or the elevators for your inspections, that maintenance contract is not bid under 149, 44A through J. It is maintenance of building systems, not janitorial, not, washing the windows or, vacuuming or something, cleaning the rugs, but maintenance of building systems is covered by this law. That's the framework. Now, the first, I'm just going in the chronological order. If you're having a project in your city or town, you have to think about, okay, we're going to build a new town hall. I'm just making it up. And it's going to be, I don't know, a $12 million project. The first thing you have to know is, do you need to hire a owner project manager? And the law is very clear. This law came into effect after the construction reform of 2005 because there were a significant number of municipal projects that had gone afoul because the municipality didn't have good advisory services, and either the design or construction contractors were not working well or honoring commitments, what have you. So the law requires that before entering into a contract for design services, right? So this is the very beginning of a project. A municipality shall contract for the services of an owner's project management, right? And they're going to consult with you during the planning, design, implementation of contracts for construction, reconstruction, right? If the project is $1.5 million or greater. So if you have any building related project that's over $1.5 million, by law, you are required to hire an owner's project manager to represent you with respect to procuring and overseeing your designer, with respect to procuring and overseeing your contractor, and with respect to overseeing the entire construction from beginning to end. The law has all kinds of pre-qualifications that are required. These people have to be have a certain amount of experience, number of years, type of licensure, and these folks are procured using an qualifications-based system. It's right in the law, and thankfully, a number of years ago, the Inspector General's CCAPPO, their procurement training program, started a class and certification process for OPMs. So most people that attend the IG's CCAPPO training are public officials, like employees like ourselves, but the big group that are private individuals or in private companies that attend that training are the OPMs, because Mass School Building Authority will not allow a municipality to go forward with any project that does not have an MCPPO certified owner's project manager on there. So they've had to have completed the Inspector General's training for OPMs. We call owner project managers OPMs, and they have to keep up annually with they have to get like recertified and updates. So that's just a real quickie on the OPM, but that's the first thing you need to think about if someone's talking about a project over $1.5 million. Next thing you have to think about is designer selection. Now, if you've got your OPM on board, they're going to help you, but you may have projects under 1.5 million. And in that instance, you're going to need to know a little bit about the law as well. So I cite the laws here. You don't have to remember them, but if you have the IG's handbook, the references to the laws are usually in there. DCAM has a slightly different process for procuring designers, as I mentioned, as a result of the Ward Commission. So in Massachusetts, for the Commonwealth's design procurement, there is a designer selection board, an independently appointed board, 11 members, and none of them are state officials. They are people from the architectural engineering disciplines, and there's one general contractor appointed by the Associated General Contractors of Massachusetts on the board as well. It requires them to keep both a master file annually on file with the designer selection board. Oops. And sorry about that. My hold on a second. We lost. For some reason, I just lost the PowerPoint. I'm gonna just re-up it for us. Okay. So the DSB, as I mentioned, has the responsibility to make the selection of our designers on behalf of the Commonwealth's projects. The criteria for a project that needs procurement under the design laws is as follows. If the fee is greater than $30,000, or if the cost is greater than 300 for construction is greater than 300,000, you must use the procurement law approaches in the law. So, but if you have a project that the fee to the designer is going to be less than $30,000, or notice the word or, not and, or the construction cost is less than $300,000, you do not need to go through, for us, our designer selection board, for you, a very formal process. The process that we use, obviously, is one, it's pretty defined in the law. The designer selection board gets applications, they review them, they have to select 3 finalists, they rank them, and the commissioner has to take the #1 ranked finalist from the designer selection board unless there's a written justification for doing otherwise. Again, we don't get to independently select our designers. Now, in order to design a public project, the law is very specific that the architect or engineer or landscape architect has to be registered in Massachusetts, licensed in Massachusetts, and the partnership, because many of these firms are multiple partners, the majority of the partners have to be registered in Massachusetts. So out-of-state firms that do not have a majority of partners that are Massachusetts licensed cannot work on any public project. Okay, so that's important. And then there's, I don't want to get into details, but there's rules for joint ventures and corporations. And this is what applies to you. It's actually Chapter 7C, Section 54 applies to municipalities. And here it says that any project where the repair or construction is exceeding $100,000, you must use a process that you have developed for your individual city or town to do selection. And again, if you have an owner's project manager, they will assist you in that. You have to have in-house, adopted in writing process that you use when you need to hire designers. That's it on that, just alerting people to the laws. Now I'm going to get into stuff that's a little more nuanced, and this is the thresholds and process for bidding the construction work. So the key to knowing how you're going to procure a construction project is all about knowing the estimated construction cost, what we call the ECC. And there are dollar thresholds. They're right there. As you can imagine, the process for less than 10,000 is the simplest, and the project for over 150,000 or the CM at risk has the most steps to it. So I'll go through these briefly here. Again, this information is in the Inspector General's handbook, but I'm just giving you an overview because that handbook can be kind of daunting when you look at it. It's like, I don't know, over 300 pages probably. So buildings that cost less than 10,000 or between 10,000 and 15,000, public building projects, remember, construction, renovation, repair, maintenance, demo, or any of those things. Under 10 and 10 to 50,000 are governed by this law. This is just references. So chapter 149, the first section of chapter 149 tells you at this dollar value, this is the law that applies. At this dollar value, you go to this law. So that 149.44a points you places. And it points you for the small project, it points you right there. It tells you exactly what you have to do. For projects from 50 to 150, Chapter 149.44a tells you that you use Chapter 3039M, which is the law that applies to all public works horizontal projects. Okay, so then 50 to 150, you're going to get the process, that same process that you would use for a horizontal project, public works project. When we get to over $150,000, it gets a little more complex, and then we are kicking in with something that's called the filed sub-bid law and requirements for DCAM certification. I'll get to that in a minute. CM at risk, I think if you recall, I mentioned in 2005 with the construction reform, it for the first time gave municipal, public, and all public entities the right to procure construction projects at 5 million or more using a construction manager at risk model, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. I want to just mention, when you see the ECC, estimated construction cost, I get calls about this every day. Well, not every day, at least a few times a week. The estimated construction cost is your estimate of the cost of the project. It can't be just a guesstimate. It needs to be an estimate. But if you have certainly a written estimate from an estimator or a designer, or if you know from past experience, you have people on your staff that have knowledge about what it's going to cost, what you estimate the cost to be is what you rely upon when you select your procurement method. So if you had a project, for example, that you thought was going to be less than $150,000, and you had a good faith reason to do that, you would talk to people, or you had good information, and you put it out as a under $150,000, you put it out under 3039M, and the bids come in a little higher, that's okay, because you did that procurement based on your own in-house best estimate of prices. We'll get to a little later, that is not a loophole to do something called bid splitting, which is undervaluing projects or chopping them up so that you can avoid a more rigorous procurement process. So less than 10,000 is easy. And I will say to you that the only time Chapter 30B, which I know most of you live with every day for your goods and service procurements, the only time 30B really comes involved here is in this under $10,000, because for under 10,000, you do not have to do an advertisement or a posting. You have to use sound business practices, and the construction procurement laws that govern everyone points us back to 30B for the definition of a sound business project, ensuring the receipt of favorable prices. And you notice it says by periodically soliciting price lists or quotes. So you can't say, well, this is the right price, and I'm just going to call company B, because we always call company B if you haven't solicited prices to make sure that they're still giving you competitive prices. Now, it's always good to get competitive prices, but under 10,000, it's not required, as long as you know that the prices you're getting are still favorable prices. There's also, again, the construction reform of 2014, that municipal reform gave us a new opportunity to do agency blanket contracts or operational services division use of their projects. So if you have projects that are under 10,000, and I'll go and actually under $50,000, you can use the either OSD's tradesperson's contract. Hold on one second. Someone opened my door and didn't close it. Sorry about that. You can use either OSD's statewide tradesperson's contract, or you, and maybe if you're a smaller city or town, you and a couple of surrounding towns can procure your own trades contracts for small procurements. And certainly these under 10 would qualify, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. What's really important to remember that even under $10,000, even if it's $200, you need to make sure that you get prevailing wage rates for the project and have given them to the vendors that are giving you pricing, that the prevailing wage will apply, that you have to make sure that the firms you are soliciting pricing from are properly licensed and insured. And with projects under 25,000, there's no bonding required and none of these other things, but you got to make sure they're licensed and insured, make sure you've given them the prevailing wage rates. When you get to the threshold from 10,000 to 50,000, you have a process you must go through. You must solicit written quotes from no fewer than 3 firms. That means asking 3 firms that you know can do your work and hopefully have already done some public work, so they're not new to it. And you must post the project, for 2 weeks on your website, in the Central Register of the Secretary of State, on Combis, which is the statewide online procurement place, and in a conspicuous place in your offices. You do have an option on these $10,000 to $50,000 projects to procure them through that blanket contract that I mentioned. So if you have authority, an awarding authority blanket contract that you've procured, let's say you want to have firms on call for electrical services, electricians. So you, depending on the size of your municipality, you might want to partner with some surrounding ones or do it yourself and go out, but you want to have a group. You're not going to select one firm, you're going to have to select a group of firms, and you'll see why in a minute, because you have to solicit at least 3 quotes or pricing under that procurement, and you have to receive at least 2 quotes. So if you have a list of 4 or 5 electricians that you've procured through a blanket contract process, and then you have need for an electrician, they're rewiring the mayor's office, and you need someone to come in and do, $30,000 worth of electrical work, you can solicit at least 3 of the firms on that list that you've developed, and then you have to get at least 2 quotes. And if you do that, you don't have to advertise. So you don't have to advertise in the Central Register, Combis, or anywhere else. But if you don't use a tradesperson's blanket contract, you've got to do the solicit 3 quotes and an advertisement. What does that mean? It's going to probably take you 3 months to bring the electrician on, versus if you're using a statewide tradesperson's contract or your own, in which case you can contact 3 firms, get some pricing in, and probably give them the project in a couple of days. Again, you want to make sure all of these firms that you are procuring, either of the ways that you procure them, are licensed and insured. You have to give them prevailing wage rates. And here is an important threshold. If the project is over $25,000 or more, you have to have them provide you with bonding. And at this dollar threshold, OSHA training is required. The contractor has to provide documentation that every single construction tradesperson that's working on the project on your site has an OSHA 10 training card. Next, we go to 50 to 150,000. Are there any questions on anything so far? No? Okay. When we get to 50 to 150, I mentioned before, we're now reverting to the same process that applies to horizontal work, to road work, parks, pools, anything like that. There's a public advertising requirement. You can't use tradespersons. Well, I'm going to go back on that a second. What I didn't tell you about tradespersons is it's been interpreted to mean that the dollar of the value of the labor is under 50,000. So you can have a project that might be, say, $70,000. I'm going to scroll back for a minute, see if that'll work. Yep, you could have a project that's, say, $70,000, And because you've got, let's say you're buying some new mechanical equipment and you have an HVAC firm coming in to put in some new boilers or HVAC chillers or something along those lines, you could have a project where you can use the statewide contract or your own tradesperson's contract if you are certain that the value of the labor is under 50 and that the reason your estimate is, say, 70 is because there's, say, $30,000 worth of equipment going into the project. And again, I just want to mention, if you don't want to procure your own entities blanket contracts, you can use the OSD statewide contracts. They have 3 of them, and each one has like 6 or more different trades or scopes of work on them. The thing about their statewide contract is, especially if you're out in Western Mass or maybe down on the Cape, I don't know how many firms they may have in your general locale. So anyway, moving along. So now we've got the projects 50 to 150. You have a public advertising 2 weeks in the Central Register, combines, newspaper of general circulation, and you have to post it at your office and on your website. There's a bid deposit required from bidders. You have to have a public bid opening. You award it to the lowest eligible and responsible bidder. Excuse me, I need to tell you, in all of these dollar categories, every single one, under 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 150, and as we keep going, you have to award the project to the lowest bidder that is eligible and responsible. And that's defined in 3039M. I'll get to it a little bit later, but for construction, it's having the skill and ability and integrity to do the work. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Again, firms need to be licensed and insured, and it's your responsibility to make sure of that. If you're using OSD tradesperson's contract, you cannot rely on them. You have to make sure yourself that they still have a valid license, that they have insurance, and that they have the skill and ability to do the work you're soliciting them for. Because the OSD's tradesperson's contract is basically like a phone book. The firms apply, they want to get on the list. OSD does not take responsibility. If you read the buyer's guide, you'll see it. They do not take responsibility for making sure that they maintain all the required licenses and insurance or anything like that. And they certainly are not going to be pulling the prevailing wage rates for you if you use OSD's tradesperson's contract to get your 3 quotes. Prevailing wage applies, of course, the OSHA training. What doesn't apply here is what we're going to talk about in a minute that applies to projects over $150,000. Now, here's my big note. It is a violation of the law to break a larger project into smaller projects to avoid a more rigorous procurement requirement. It's called bid splitting. And it also is a violation of the law to manipulate an ECC, knowingly manipulate an ECC to make sure that it's under a certain threshold, as I mentioned earlier. So, in order to bid on these projects over 150,000, the prime contractor and the filed subbidders, and I'll tell you about those in a minute, must be certified by DCAM. So DCAM we wear 3 hats. 90% of our hats, or 98% of our hat, is building all the Commonwealth's, designing, building, and maintaining all the major Commonwealth buildings, courthouses, prisons, mental health facilities, the State House, our building here at 1 Ashburton, and buildings across the Commonwealth. We also lease significant numbers of places. A lot of you, I'm sure, have gone to registries of motor vehicle that are maybe in malls or somewhere else. Those are all things that are procured under DCAM's hat. But outside of the state agency and entity real estate services that and construction services that we provide, we have 2 other roles that relate to what I'm talking about today. And one is DCAM certification. We have a separate unit that doesn't get involved in any of our building projects, but solely certifies contractors to bid on public work in Massachusetts. It's like a license to bid. It's not a license, but certification is required from any contractor that wants to perform services on a building project for any public entity in Massachusetts, if the project is estimated to cost over $150,000. So we have a team of people that do DCAM certification. We'll talk about that in a minute. What I want to say that's important at the moment is that there are actually 28 categories of prime contractor certification, which is sort of mind-boggling because most of us think you've got a construction project, you're going to hire a contractor to be a general contractor who does general building construction, who's then going to hire all the different subcontractors under them. So they're going to manage the work. Maybe they do some of it, but they're going to hire the electrician, the plumber, et cetera, et cetera. But in fact, some of our projects are not general building contracts. They may be solely roofing. They may be solely HVAC, or a large portion of them may be solely roofing or solely HVAC. They may be a restoration of historic masonry on the outside of an older building. They could be elevator overhauls. So there are 28 different specialty categories that if you have a project that is predominantly roofing, predominantly mechanical, predominantly historic masonry, predominantly anything, look at the DCAM website and see what the other certification categories are. Because if you have a roofing project with just a little bit of electrical and maybe some glass and glazing, I'm just trying to think of things here, you don't need to hire a GC who's going to mark up prices if you can have an HVAC manage the job and bring on the small amount of electrical and whatever is needed. So always check the DCAM website on the categories of certification when you're undertaking a project that has sort of a specialty focus. In addition to that, the filed subbidders, who are a certain portion of the subcontractors on a project, certain categories of work also must be DCAM certified in their trades. And that applies if the project is over $150,000 for the prime. And when we talk about the filed subbidders, if the project is over 150 and their scope of work. So let's say the project 170, if the HVAC is 25,000 or more, then the HVAC subcontractor has to be DCAM certified and has to bid in a way that I will explain in a moment. There's also something called paragraph E thresholds. I won't go into them, but in certain trades like HVAC and electrical, there are subspecialties underneath. The typical electrician or HVAC firm will not do, let's say, their ductwork for HVAC or some of the specialty tel data wiring for electrical. And there's a process there for bidding as well. These are public bid openings, and it's a two-phase bidding process. So there are two bid openings. So when you advertise a project over $150,000, the bid documents that you're preparing have to reflect what your certification category for your prime contractor is, and have to reflect which filed subbid categories apply to the project. What happens is those filed subbid categories to apply to this project in any major building project, if you're building a new town hall or what have you, you're going to have probably 10 or more of the 18 filed subbid trades working on that job. So what happens is the filed subbid firms submit their pricing first, and then the general contractor picks which electrical price it wants to take, which plumbing subcontractor and its price they want to take, which painting subcontractor and their price they want to take, which masonry. They select and they put the pricing of the filed subbidders that they select into their bid, and then add the rest of the work and their pricing into the bid. So that's why we have a two-phase process. Filed subbidders bid first, and then the general contractors bid. Payment and performance bonds are required on these projects. And as I mentioned earlier, we talked about you have to award the project to the lowest eligible and responsible bidder. Eligible means they have to have their DCAM certification. They have to be certified to bid in the category of work that they're putting a bid in. For the prime contractor, they have to have something called a single project limit and an aggregate project limit within the scope of this. So to be certified as a prime contractor, not only do you get certified, but the compliance office, when they're certifying them, makes a determination based on their past experience what the largest project is that they can bid on and what the largest amount of aggregate work they can have in their firm at the time is. Why? To avoid firms to getting in over their head and defaulting on public projects. These are the kinds of requirements that came out of as a result of the Ward Commission's findings, this DCAM certification process. Once they've submitted their certificate of eligibility, they also have to submit something called an update statement, which is telling us how much work and what they've done. They apply for certification once a year. The update statement updates anything that's changed from the time they applied for this year's certification. They must have a complete and signed bid. They have to have a bid bond, a bunch of stuff that has to be in the package. If all that's in the package, they're deemed eligible. Responsible is a determination you make, also based on whether this firm possesses the skill, ability, and integrity to perform the work based on a determination of competent workmanship and financial soundness. That's right out of the law. When I first started working here and traveling the state and talking to folks like you, I'd inevitably have somebody raise their hand and say, you know, we had this contractor, they really are horrible, but we have to take the low bidder. And I'd say, no, you do not have to take the low bidder. You actually make a determination as to who is the responsible bidder. If this firm just got indicted for fraud, if this firm defaulted on a prior project with you, if this firm has a history of being a bad actor, you can make a determination that they're not responsible. What you need to be mindful of is to never make that determination without talking to your own legal counsel, because they may challenge your determination and you need to be able to defend it. So it's always best, if you're going to actually reject a general bidder, to talk to legal counsel before you do that, because I'm in the midst of one right now. We rejected a contractor for a bid that was something called unbalanced, and they have just filed a bid protest. But not a problem. We know that we did the right thing. And they consulted with a lawyer, me. So I also want to mention that on projects that are over $10 million, you're also, in addition, required not only to make sure that the firms are DCAM certified, but before you actually do the bidding, you must go through a pre-qualification process, which I'll go over in a minute. But the pre-qualification process is not optional for municipalities, so you will have to go through that for on the larger jobs. It's sort of like a more refined, it's like certification plus. Again, you always want to make sure the firms are currently properly licensed and insured, and you don't want to sign a construction contract with any contracting firm that hasn't shown you a COI, a certificate of insurance, that has active insurance in place at the time that's signing the contract to cover general liability, pollution, workers' comp, auto, and builder's risk, just off the top of my head. Prevailing wage, of course, applies, OSHA training, and in these projects, DCAP certification is required. What do you have to do? Advertise on combis, in a local newspaper, in the Central Register, on your website. And at this dollar threshold, there are a lot of bulletins, online bulletins. Nowadays, Dodge Bulletin used to be a printed one, but there are a whole bunch of companies whose job, you know, in the digital age, that pull together public procurements, and market their site as a place for contractors to find work. So, as I mentioned, the bids must be submitted before the deadline, both for the filed sub-bid and the general bid. They're firm. If someone comes in, if the clock strikes 2 and the bids are due at 2, once the clock strikes 2, you cannot accept a late bid. The bids must be complete, signed, and they must acknowledge any substantive addenda. They must be accompanied by a bid deposit of 5% of the dollar value of the bid. They must have a current and valid certificate of eligibility. They must have completed and signed update statement, or they will be rejected. In DCAM's regs, there is a little bit of language about when you can allow them to, let's say, make non-substantive corrections on an update statement. So sometimes on the update statement, they can make some corrections, but some stuff is fatal on that. And if you have any questions about that, you can both look at the law itself You can look in the handbook, the IG's handbook, or you can contact the AG's office, the bid protest unit. Deb Anderson over there has actually right on their website, they have some sort of Q&As of sort of simple things that you might encounter that you want advice on.
Susan,
So, yep.
sorry, there's a question. Shanna, do you want to just unmute?
Hi, can you tell us about the small and new business DCAM certification? Is it the same process that they have to go through in order to get that license?
Great question. Hold on, I'm going to get there. I'm going to tell you a little bit more detail about certification, and it will be in there. Okay, so hang in there.
Great,
if I don't,
thanks.
then remind me. Any other questions at the moment? Okay, so these are those 18 trades. Roofing, flashing, metal, windows, right? Most projects have, and decent sized project have roofing, they have windows, they have waterproofing. Miscellaneous and ornamental iron is things like the brackets they use for structural steel, the kind of railings they put sometimes in stairwells for emergency exits, or maybe ornamental iron in the building. Lath and plastering, acoustical tile, that's ceiling tiles. Marble tile, that's not acoustical tile, that's tiles. Terrazzo, resilient flooring, glass and glazing, painting, plumbing, HVAC, electrical, elevators, masonry, and fire protection. That's on a typical good-sized project. If you're building a new building, that work usually accounts for at least 50% and oftentimes more, up to 55 or more % of the dollars that go into a project. So the vast majority of dollars and all of these trades are bid through that filed submit process, where you as an awarding authority advertise the project. You advertise that there is work in the trades that apply to your project. Your specifications have to have, by law, the specifications for these trades have to be clearly identified as filed sub-bid. This is painting filed sub-bid. This section is painting filed sub-bid. This section is elevator filed sub-bid. They have to be specially designated, and all the work of those trades must appear only in that section of the specifications. It's very, the law is very, shall I say, protective of the filed sub-bid trades. So again, as I mentioned, you're going to first receive the filed sub-bid bids. Then you as an awarding authority with your OPM and your designer will look at those filed sub-bids. You're going to look to make sure that the low filed sub-bids in each of the categories are good and valid bids. I'll talk about this a little bit, but you'd basically do a D-scope. You have your designer, possibly working with your OPM, calling the low bidder in every trade that applies. Hi, you submitted the apparent low bid, right? We want to make sure that you understand the scope of the work, that you have all these elements of the work. We want to make sure you're comfortable with your price, especially if the price is out of line with maybe 5 other prices that came in. They're going to really want to go through it. Are you sure you have all the work in here? You're 20% lower than any other bidder, blah, blah, blah. Bidders have an ability. So you have a bid bond. The bid bond is there to make sure that they don't just back out for no reason. I decided I don't want the work, I'm walking away. Can't do that. That's when you can claim on the bid bond. However, under the law, if they claim they made a clerical error in preparing the bid, they have a right to ask to withdraw, and you have the ability to make a determination that they made an honest error and that allow them to withdraw without claiming on their bid bond. And typically that happens when we see it somewhat frequently, where they were doing a takeoff. They've got a list of 27 million prices there and they're adding them all up, and they either didn't multiply out a number. Let's say, they needed 100 hours of work time and they only put in 10 by accident. They didn't add something right. Those kinds of things, we do allow them to withdraw, but they get to ask to withdraw. It's not automatic. The awarding authority has to make a decision that they made an error that meets the statutory requirement to relieve them and allow them to withdraw. Otherwise, you have the right to claim on their bond, because now you're going to go to the next highest bidder, which is obviously a price difference. Anyway, once you've reviewed those filed sub-bidders and made sure that certainly the low ones anyway have prices that they're still comfortable with and that have all the scope of work in it, You have to, by law, distribute that list to all the firms that requested plans and specs, and then the general contractor will select from that list its plumber, its electrician, its mason, its painter that it's going to carry with its bid. It's important to know that they do not have to carry the low bidder. They do not have to. Oftentimes, to meet, say, an MBEWB goal, if the price is not too far off, they might hire someone a little more expensive. Or it may be that the firm that's second lowest bid is a firm they know and trust, and the low bidder is a firm they've had a bad experience with. So they get to do that. The law does allow you to ask them. If an awarding authority can say, hey, you've picked the second, we'd like you to pick the low bidder, and then lower the price accordingly. But they get to say, no, we didn't hire the low bidder because, and frankly, DCAM, I don't think we've ever done that, because normally if a bidder has carried someone other than the low filed subbidder, they have a really good reason. And so anyway, that's just anecdotal. So then you've received, opened, and reviewed the general bids. Again, you have to award it to the lowest eligible responsible, and the same thing happens is before you award your prime bidder, you can do a couple things. The law requires you or your owner's project manager to contact DCAM certification office and review the files of the certification for the lowest bidder. So you're going to want to see all their prior evaluations that discuss the quality. By the way, you can do this for every single filed subbidder as well. You're supposed to do it for all the filed subbidders, but it's critically important when you're doing your prime bidder. So you're going to look at the DCAM certification files, or your OPM will do it. And you're also going to do that descoping meeting, making sure the GC is comfortable. They've got all the work in there, that everything's good. They're going to meet their price. And again, they may, after looking back and seeing if they identify an error, they may request a withdrawal. So keep flipping through. Bonding threshold. So I think I mentioned early, for anything of $25,000 above, you must get a payment bond. For projects 150 and over, you're supposed to get both payment and performance bonds. The IG's handbook has this information. And again, those charts that I mentioned, I think it's like a 5-page pamphlet, little like what applies charts, also will reference the bonding thresholds and requirements. It's important to know this, though, that last paragraph. So on chapter 149, 44A through J, the regular design, bid, build. You design the project, it's fully designed. You put it out to bid with the filed sub bids coming in first, the general bids coming in next. On those projects, the filed sub bidders are not required to have a to provide a bonding unless the general contractor asks for it. So right on the bid form, there's a place where the general contractor would say, yes, I want a bond from my plumbing contractor, or yes, I want a bond. But if the general contractor on a 149A through J project asks for a bond, they have to cover the cost of the bond. If they ask a filed sub-bid subcontractor for the bond, they have to cover the cost for it. In all projects that require pre-qualification, or any project where you've had pre-qualification, but it's projects 10 million and up, and on all CMA projects, the filed subbidders must provide their own payment and performance bonds. They don't have an option, the law requires it. And on those projects, the filed subbidders on 10 million plus and CM at-risk projects must carry the cost of their bids, their payment and performance bonds in their own bid price. So that's just important to note, and your project procurement documents should clearly state on those larger projects and those CM projects that their bids have to carry that price. That's mandated by the applicable law. I talked a little bit about those blanket contracts for awarding authorities. Here's the language from them here, right? So it says right here, oh shoot, what did I just do? Once again, I lost. I apologize for this. It says right here, you can procure your own blanket contract. You use the chapter 3039 process to procure them, so you don't have to deal with the filed sub bid law or anything. But again, you still have to solicit 3 quotes and you have to obtain at least 2 quotes to select someone. And if you do that, you do not have to advertise. Now I'm going to get to contractor certification briefly. And here, hold on, give me 1 second. Okay, so as I mentioned, prime contractor certification is required on any contract over $150,000, any building contract. And we have, as was mentioned in the question from Shauna, we have a new, it's not so new anymore, small prime contractor certification available. So these are smaller firms that maybe aren't going to be working on your larger projects, but it's a certification level that's sort of an entry level for firms, or for firms that really just want to work on, shall I say, the under $500,000 projects. And so it's there as well. And then separate filed submitter certification again. All of these apply if the project is 150,000 and over, and for filed sub-bid if you have a project over 150,000 and the work of that sub-bid is over 25. So you may have a project where you have a 200,000 or even a $300,000 project, but the acoustical ceiling work is 20,000. You wouldn't have filed sub-bid requirements for that portion of the work in that particular project. So in addition to our general regular construction projects, as I mentioned earlier, the prime or general certification is also required on CM at risk projects, and it's also required in Chapter 25A special energy projects. In these projects, in CM at risk projects, the procurement of the CM, and in 25A energy projects, the procurement of the energy vendor is not a low bid. It is a quality-based, best value type process. And so other aspects of the public bidding laws will not apply there, and I'm going to get into them at least for CM at risk in a minute. But the DCAM certification of the prime contractor still applies in those situations. Now, the filed sub-bidder certification applies in regular design bid build, Chapter 149, 44A through J. The process I just went through are those design bid build projects, and the filed sub-bidder certification also applies in CM at risk, Chapter 149A projects. Sub-bidder does not apply to the 25A energy projects. So the question is it above $150,000? Then you're going to be looking for your firms to be certified. And in your invitation to bid for the prime contractors, you must tell them what category of work you want them certified in. Is it general building construction? Is it historic masonry? Is it mechanical systems, et cetera, et cetera? There's 28 categories you can pick from. Okay, so this is just a little chart. When do you need it? When don't you? DCAM certification, not under 150,000. Yes, over $150,000. Pre-qual is required, so it's a little chart right here. Again, this information is available from the IG's materials as well. Here's the conversation about evaluation. You as an awarding authority are required by law at the end of at 2 points in a project, the midpoint and after the conclusion, to evaluate every prime contractor and every filed sub-bid subcontractor on your projects. Now, if you have an OPM, they're going to work with you. They're going to work with the general contractor. Oh, damn, I keep making the same mistake. And they're going to help you prepare these evaluations. But by law, they're required to be submitted. The midpoint evaluation at about 50% of the project, there's a requirement for a midterm evaluation. That is evaluation that does not get submitted to DCAM. It's not the final evaluation that is used to determine if the firm should be certified, but it is an evaluation that is useful to you as an awarding authority, particularly if there are problems with the contractor. If you have a contractor who's underperforming there are problems, there are issues, and you give them an honest and accurate midterm evaluation, they will realize that potentially, if it's bad enough, they risk getting a failing score or a low score when you evaluate the project. You have this bat over their heads that you hold. The power you hold over a contractor is you're going to be evaluating them finally at the end of a project, but at the mid-time, you get a chance to get them, tell them where they stand, and then they have the opportunity to right the ship, so to speak. So I cannot tell you how important that midterm evaluation is. And if they're doing a good job, great, let them know it. I've seen instances on many occasions where a firm's gotten a poor midterm evaluation, and as a result, for example, they'll remove a poorly performing project manager and replace them with someone better to get the project on board. For most of these firms, their public work is their livelihood. If they lose their DCAM certification and they cannot bid, that's huge. That puts them out of business, possibly for 3 or more years. So they pride themselves on quality work and good evaluations, and it's required. It's required if they want to continue to bid public work. So the midterm is not submitted to DCAM. The final evaluation is. It must be submitted. You see right here, within 90 days of project completion, or the law says that if public awarding authorities do not submit public evaluations of their prime and filed sub-bid subcontractors, you could lose state funding. When I used to go around the state, now we're doing it on Zoom, of course, but for many years ago, there was a lot of misconceptions out in the world. One of them was you had to take the low bidder no matter what. And the other one was, oh my God, I don't want to give a bad evaluation because I'm going to get sued and I'm going to lose my, I don't know what, my boat, my house. If they had a boat, God bless. But the law has always had a provision in it, and it's still there. It indemnifies you as a public official and the representatives of public agencies in terms of providing accurate evaluations to subcontractors. So if you get sued personally for a bad evaluation that failed a contractor, or even just one they didn't like, your public awarding authority has a statutory obligation to defend and indemnify you for $1 million. And the only reason you might not be indemnified is if you act willfully, wantonly, and recklessly. And I'm sure no one on this call ever does that when they're working in their professional capacities. If you accurately reflect the problems with a contractor, and if you're having problems with them, your OPM or whoever's managing them needs to just document, hey, the contractor, didn't send people to the site this week. The contractor had, unsafe, whatever it is that wasn't working on the project. The project was delayed by 9 months and there was no reason, they failed to man the project. There's a million reasons that you might, give poor scores to on an evaluation of a contractor, but rest assured that the law provides indemnification of you if and when that happens, and it is very, 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 very rare. I have never met anyone who has been sued for poor evaluation. Now, you may have the contractor threatening or whatever, shame on them. And again, what used to happen, and I hope that it doesn't happen. I like to think it doesn't happen, but in the old days, and again, I'll give you an example right now. I remember early on, I've been doing this for 21 years. I went and spoke at some municipal, I think it was a Mass Municipal Association, or maybe it was a MASBO thing. But I was at a presentation, and a guy raised his hand and he said, we have this company and they, did a really horrible job on a project. They did it for us, I don't know, 6 years ago. And, and they did a terrible job. And then they bid again and they were low bidder, and we gave them another job and they did a horrible job on that one. It was a nightmare. And they just submitted the low bid on our third project. And I said, so what's the problem? Just reject them as not responsible. And and then he said, well, I don't know if we can, whatever. So he came up afterwards and he told me, well, we didn't want to, the first time they were bid, we didn't want to flunk them, they they offered to do this and that. They were going to do some punch list work. They can do this and that. Basically, there was I won't going to say a trade-off, but they didn't flunk them. And the second time, same thing. Oh, we didn't want to flunk them. We didn't. And so now, third time around, they have no basis to reject them really because they passed them on the 2 prior evaluations. And shame on them, but then they're also passing that contractor on to you and to DCAM and everyone else because nobody knows that they were subperforming on the prior 2 jobs. So all I can say is it's our public interest responsibility, your public responsibility to make sure that these firms are accurately evaluated. A huge part of certifying a contractor is based on their prior evaluations. If they have 3 failing scores or 2 failing scores of significant nature, they will lose their certification for a period of time. If you don't give failing scores to contractors or even low scores, people don't know that they're bad. So that's my little lecture on that. Again, they must be completed when you have an OPM. The OPM, this is again at the 50% form point, the OPM has to sign off on them. And on the larger projects over 1.5 million, you and the OPM can sign off, must sign off on the evaluation, and sometimes the architect can sign off as well. It's all on the evaluation form. Actually, the evaluation forms were recently updated. And again, they must be submitted promptly after completion. The copy of the preliminary stays with you. It goes to the contractor. It doesn't come to DCAM. We don't get them. We don't want them. We only look at the final one. The midterm is between you and the contractor to help them know where they stand and hopefully rectify problems if there are any. Just as important to know, even if you give a bad evaluation, and a bad evaluation might not be a flunking one, it might just be, an 82 instead of a 92. But the contractor always has a right to submit a rebuttal to DCAM. Those rebuttals go into the file at DCAM right with the evaluations. So, oh geez, there's a typo there. What's a reminder? I better fix that. In any event, so they have a right to respond. And sometimes where there's a real dispute between what the contractor says and what the awarding authority says, especially if it's kind of thing where there might be a flunking score, DCAM does look into these things and will maybe contacts the parties to try to see and make sure that that everything makes sense and what have you. So that's, I think, it on the ways contractor certification works. But here's a list that basically tells you what we look at, right? So the single project limits, right? If you look here, because of the question on small primes, right? Here they can do no more than $1 million maximum of work, whereas a regular prime contractor, there's no set limits. We have contractors that are, hundreds of millions of dollars limitations on their aggregate work abilities. So the look back is the same. Now, if you notice here, because the difference is, so I'm at value of projects. So a small prime, a regular prime, they have to have projects of $80,000 or more for us to count them. Here for a small prime, they can have smaller projects, $50,000 for each project. Okay. Also, for some small firms, the financial statements down at the bottom, CPA reviewed or CPA audited, those cost a lot of money. So sometime they'll take, for small primes, we'll accept a CPA compiled financial statement. So there are some small differences. Small differences in terms of what we accept. Here is bonding. The bonding is the same. Most of the stuff is the same. This is important. And as I mentioned, in order to have a passing score, they must have an 80 above. For each evaluation, any score under 80 would be a failing score. That is the same across the board. But really, it's the audited financials and the size of the projects that are a little different for the small contractors. Okay, so on our website, there's lots of information. One of the really great things there is our standard contractor evaluation form. You're going to need it to fill it out. We have a list of all the DCAM certified primes and filed subbidders. Again, 28 categories of certified primes, 18 categories of certified filed subbidders. When you're looking to see what category of work, or are there enough bidders in your area, if you're in a more remote part of the state, you can go to DCAM's website. Let's say you're going to put out a project for, it's the old town hall and it's got masonry, it needs repointing. You're trying to retain the historical building, and you want to look and see, you want to put it out as a prime historical, historical building or historical masonry project. You want to look at DCAM's certified vendor pool to make sure that there are enough vendors certified in that, in, let's say, the western part, or at least the central to western part of the state. So it's a good way to see who your bidder pool might be. You'll also see, so for example, DCAM, we put out some very large projects. We can see who's got single and aggregate project limits big enough for a large project, if we have a several $100 million project. Our DCAM regulations for certification are on there. You can read about what you're required to do. There's a whole section about what awarding authorities are required to do as part of reviewing bids. And for DCAM certification, there's guidelines and procedures there, and also there's the list of debarred contractors. You have to make sure that none of the firms that are bidding to you are debarred, which means they've been banned from bidding public work for usually some fairly egregious activities they've been involved in. I've been going on for a bit. Do you think we should take a break?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to offer earlier, but you were on such a roll. Do you want to take like a 5-10 minute break?
Whatever you think is appropriate for your folks.
Okay, let's do 10 minutes. That way everybody can grab some coffee, go to the bathroom if needed, and so I'll see everybody back at 11:30. So I'll stay on. In fact, if anybody needs me or wants to ask questions, feel free.
Hey, Jennifer?
Hi, yes.
Did I hear this correctly? The estimated cost of a project that determines the threshold, it applies to or can apply to just the labor, not the total cost of the project?
Susan will probably answer that best.
If you're in the trade, if it's a 50,000 and under.
Okay, I've never heard that before. Is that new?
Well, when when they, in 2014, when they did the municipal reform law, they added this whole thing about trade persons. It's the trade persons portion, right? So if you're trying to get someone off the OSD tradespersons contract, or you're trying to get someone off of your own project, a list, to get bids for, let's say, a small electrical project or a small painting project, if the value of the painting labor is under 50, and painting's not a good example because painting doesn't have a lot of materials. It mostly applies in like electrical or mechanical systems. But let's say you're putting in some new water heaters, right? And the labor is 40,000, but the equipment is another 20, right? That would put you up to 60. But they're only going to look at the value of the labor, not on all jobs. It's on those
trade contracts.
And those things where you're going to get, okay?
Yeah, no, that's pretty big for us, because a lot of the components that we have installed, the labor is a fraction of the cost of the actual project. It's actually the material. So I just wasn't aware of that.
But it doesn't apply. You can't use that argument for 150. That's for stuff under at 50,000 and under, right?
Absolutely.
You can't take a $150,000 project and say, well, it's really $110,000 of equipment and 40. You still have to do file sub bid, but just at that small area, absolutely. It's been interpreted that way by
Debbie Anderson.
Debbie Anderson. I actually helped write the law, so I know what it's in it. But it's been interpreted both by DCAM, Deb Anderson, and the IG's office that you can do it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to take a quick break. I'll see everybody at 11:30. I'm just going to turn my camera off feel free to stick around or walk away. Okay, looks like it's 11:31. Hope everybody got a chance to stretch their legs.
Hope everybody's still awake.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure there are.
Okay, we'll keep scrolling around then. So now I'm going to talk briefly. The rest of these slides are fairly brief, so we're good. We're through the most complicated parts of it are behind us. How's that? So now I'm going to talk briefly about pre-qual again. This is for projects that are over $10 million. See, every so often I lose my ability to flip. There we go. There we go. Flip the slide. So the pre-qualification process is mandatory for projects, for certain projects. So the projects that are building projects that are over 10 million or more, you must do pre-qualification for the prime contractor and the filed subbidders. And on CM at risk projects, construction manager at risk projects, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, you have to do pre-qualification also of the construction manager and the trade filed subbid contractors. So a CM project can be done, a project of 5 million and more can be a CM at risk project. So if either it's any CM at risk project or any project over $10 million, you do mandatory pre-qual. It is discretionary for projects under 10 million, and there are certain awarding authorities that are exempt. None of them are municipal, so it doesn't make sense to really talk about that at this point. So what is it? It's a two-phased procurement process. First, you determine whether the firms are eligible to bid. If you pre-qualify them, are they qualified to bid? And then only the firms that are pre-qualified get to bid. So you are potentially limiting the bidder pool, but only to the extent that you're really taking out firms that are just not qualified for the work. Okay, this is not meant to be a fashion show. You don't like a contractor, we won't pre-qual them. This is meant to be that you have substantial reasons not to pre-qualify them. So the RFQ phase is, and the law, both the law for CM at risk projects and the law for pre-qualification on the design bid build, the Chapter 149 projects, are very clear about what's in the RFQ and what you can ask and how you can select them. So depending on whether it's a CM at risk project, you're going to look at Chapter 149A pre-qual, which is in sections 6 for the CM and section 8 for the filed sub bid trades. And in Chapter 149 design bid build, you'll be looking at the sections on pre-qualification there as well. On our website, we have regulations and guidelines for pre-qualification on regular Chapter 149 projects, and on 149A projects, we have model documents because we do that as well. And again, only the pre-qualified bidders get an opportunity to bid. Again, there are, especially on the filed sub-bidders and trade subcontractors, there are, say 10 categories of questions that you ask. There's mandatory submissions. This is not a lot of, you don't have a lot of ability to do what you want here. There are mandatory questions you have to ask, what you can, and there's a mandatory score for this. They have to get a score of 70 or more to get pre-qualified. So again, you're gonna, on these larger projects, you're gonna have an OPM. They're gonna help you through it. But geez, please be mindful that, remember, if you've got a bigger project, you got to hire the OPM first. Then you're going to hire the designer. And then before you can hire the contractors and the filed subbidders on the larger projects, the 10 million and over and the CM at risk, before you can get them bidding, you got to allow time for pre-qual. These things are important because they take additional time. But again, at the end of the day, the pool here, the purpose here is to make sure that firms, so for example, DCAM does some very highly specialized projects. For example, we've designed data centers where the entire building is housing, millions of dollars of high-tech computer equipment, servers, things I don't even know what the names are. The Department of Revenue and all the state agencies have their life's blood in the data there. In those buildings, they have like super high redundancy on electrical, mechanical, all of those systems, they have to keep the buildings cool. They have to keep, so those projects, we had very unique requirements for both the prime contractor and the certain of the filed sub-bid trades to have worked in these level 3 redundancy projects. We do sometimes at some of the universities and lab buildings, we build buildings where they're working on, viruses and bacteria and with hazardous substances. And so those rooms and those parts of the buildings have to have special ventilation systems, special safety systems, special wall coverings. Those also we would be using pre-qual to make sure that the firms bidding on that very specialized work have done those kinds of very sensitive projects before. That's one example where pre-qual really does become important. So now I'm going to talk a little more about CM at risk. I've been talking about it and referring to it in general. It is a procurement method that has existed for decades in the private sector, but the public agencies, we did not have an opportunity to use it until the construction reform of 2005. And when it first came out, there was a lot of hesitation, but I think most of the awarding authorities have, if you have any major projects, it is a good option to consider. It's not always the right option. We don't always use CM at risk at DCAM for projects over 5 million, but certainly for the larger, more complex ones, we generally do. So what is a CM at risk services? What is the difference between a situation where you design the project, you put out specs, and you hire a general contractor to build it? That was our old model. It still exists, but that was the only model we had up until 2005. The CM at risk is really the construction manager isn't really, generally speaking, involved in the actual construction at all. They're really serving as a construction manager in a true sense. And they come on earlier in the project. So they are hired early on in the project so that while the project is still in the study and design phases, they're providing cost estimates. So you'll get a cost estimate from the designer and a cost estimate from the CM, and you can reconcile them because sometimes they're different. So you've got better, stronger cost estimates. You get consultation all along the way regarding the design. The designer is talking about building this really funky looking building on the top of a mountain. And the CM says, I don't know how buildable that is. It's going to cost another $10 million to secure the ground around it, whatever it is. The people that are going to build it are involved in designing it. So you've got sort of two perspectives instead of one on the design. They help set up and prepare and coordinate how the project's going to be bid, what packages are going to be bid, and they do that early on. They're thinking about it as the project's design. Scheduling is important, a realistic schedule. Designer may have one idea, a CM may have another, but they're back and forth all along the way. This is huge cost control. They also call that value engineering. The designer might have this amazing idea for, again, maybe a really funky looking curtain wall. And the contractor can say, that's fine and dandy, but the only firm that provides that is out on the West Coast, and they are backed up 9 months to provide. I mean, whatever it is, they've got perspectives about cost and availability of components and systems that are going to be really helpful. You don't want to have a building fully designed and then find out that some key components either are so outrageously expensive or not available. So their involvement there is important. They assist in all that pre-qual. So they're involved in that pre-qual process that we talked about for all the filed sub-bidders. And then after the building is, the study is completed, after as the design is going on, when it comes time to start work, they actually serve as the GC. They're the firm that signs the contracts, that procures the non-filed sub-bid subcontracts, is involved in the procurement of the filed sub-bid subcontracts, and they are managing all these firms during the construction. And so they're there from almost the birth of the project till its completion, along with your OPM and your designers. But they are, and the interesting thing about them is they get a fee. So they don't actually, with the CM at risk project, you're paying for the cost of the work that goes to all the subcontractors that are doing the work with the hammers and the and the drills and the cranes and the heavy site equipment. You're paying for the price of all of that. at a competitive rate, because all of those are bid competitively. Every single package on the project of subcontract work is bid competitively. The CM is selected based on its qualifications and a price. So it's a best value, but they know what they're going to get coming in. They don't have a incentive to cut corners or to bury you in change orders on their own behalf. So it's a different dynamic, at least when you're working with a good quality CM. It's optional to awarding authorities on every project of 5 million or more. You don't have to do it, but it's available. In order to do a CM at risk project as a municipality, you must get approval from the Inspector General's office before you're approved to use a CM at risk method. So again, remember we talked about building in time? If your owner's project manager and you, a designer, are starting to think about, wait, maybe we should bid this as CM at risk, then you really want to get to it and apply to get that approval, because you've got an extra step to get approved before you can start procuring your CM. And again, the CM is actually, and the filed sub-trades all have to still be DCAM certified. As I mentioned, all of these CMs and filed sub-trade contractors must be DCAM certified and pre-qual. They go through the pre-qual project. And all the regular laws apply to CM at risk, prevailing wage, demands for direct payment, all of that applies for those projects as well. Emergency procurement's everybody's favorite topic. That's when I get to meet many of you, oftentimes just through letters and emails, but we get to meet you quite often because these inevitably happen, and many of them are seasonal. We always know it's going to get busy around August time because the schools are reopening and buildings that have been closed up are being opened up, and there's maybe moisture problems or problems with heating systems or whatever. So that's one of the times, and anytime there's unusual storms, we hear from you, and then the day-to-day stuff that just inevitably happens. So what's really important to remember is that the emergency waiver law, the emergency procurement laws for construction services are meant to be utilized only when there's an immediate threat to health, safety, and property as a result of the emergency, and there is not adequate time to use the normal advertising and bidding processes and still without a threat to health, safety, and property. So that's the number one thing we have to remember with these. So right here's the law, it's an excerpt. In cases of extreme emergency, you can seek approval from DCAM, it says the commissioner, it's DCAM, for that portion of the work necessary to preserve the health or safety or property to alleviate an imminent security threat. So what's key here is there has to be a threat to health, safety, or property or security, and you can only request an emergency waiver for the portion of the work that's necessary. So if you've got a roof on a building that's leaking in one location, you can only submit an emergency waiver to do that one location. You can't use it for the entire new roof. Your own neglect of an ongoing project for the last 10 years is not an emergency basis for an emergency waiver. You are supposed to maintain the quality and integrity of your buildings, but sometimes things happen and we recognize that. And then the nature of this emergency must be such that it is an adequate time to do the normal 3 weeks of advertising. And in the case of filed subbidding, the additional 3 weeks for filed subbid submission, et cetera. You must submit these emergency waiver requests to DCAM in advance of actually procuring someone to fix it, unless it happens on a night or weekend. You're supposed to call us the minute it arises to say, we've got an emergency, this is what happened. As soon as you know enough information, again, if it happens on a weekend or overnight or on a holiday, you're supposed to contact us the next business day. Now, what we need to know to grant your emergency waiver, and this is on our website, there are like 8 points that you have to address in your letter. So we want a letterhead from your municipality. It needs to be signed by someone. In COVID, we're accepting electronic signatures, but it needs to be on a letterhead. Don't have your engineering firm send it. Don't have the contractor send it. It has to come from you. And it has to tell us what kind of waiver you're seeking. For building projects, you're going to want the waiver of bidding, of advertising and bidding. For Chapter 33 for horizontal projects, you really only need an advertising waiver because the laws are a little different. So just tell us, do you want waiver of bidding, advertising and bidding, or just advertising? The nature of the emergency. In other words, what happened, right? What happened and why is it an immediate threat to health, safety, and property? That's the first thing we want to know. That's actually the second. What kind of a waiver do you want? What happened and why is it an immediate threat? When did you become aware of it? Because if you knew about it 3 months ago and you're telling us now, well, if you'd advertised it 3 months ago, you would have had a contractor. So we don't like to see an emergency waiver request of something you knew about. Now, sometimes you might have known about it 3 months ago. You tried to fix it. You tried to repair. The repair didn't work. You tried again. It didn't work. And so now you are 3 months later and you really need an emergency waiver because you've got to do something bigger. That's fine. But you're supposed to contact it immediately when these things happen. How did you become aware of it? And when did you become aware of it, right? And then what's the scope of work that you're going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to do the whole roof or are you just going to do the portion? If you've got masonry, here's a perfect example. There was a building right next to the old MDC building. If people remember back to that the old MDC building was right next door to 1 Ashburton Place down in Boston here. And it was so old, it was a historic building. And some of the bricks were just, the masonry facade was just falling down. We didn't do an emergency waiver to repair the emergency facade. We did an emergency waiver to put up scaffolding and netting and everything else to protect people on the sidewalk. So sometimes an emergency waiver is to get a temporary generator, perhaps, until you can get a new system into a building, depends. But the scope of work we need to know, why the normal amount of bidding time is insufficient, why you must get an emergency waiver here. Okay. And what process are you going to use to maximize competition? So an emergency waiver doesn't mean you just get to call up Jim Corporation. It means you don't have to advertise, but you are supposed to seek competitive quotes to the extent possible. Now, if a building just collapsed on somebody and you need a firm to come out, all right, it's the first firm who gets there. But that's the exception. Almost every emergency waiver we get, there's adequate time to call 3 firms and see who can get out there. Now, if you've called 5 firms and only 2 have gotten out there and you got to go, you got to go. But you've got to let us know that you're going to seek competitive pricing on the building procurements, the ones that are building. On the horizontal, you get to decide, but again, we always recommend a competitive quote, especially when you're in a dollar value above 10,000 or certainly 50,000. And sometimes we get emergency waivers that are significant funds. We saw a lot of that at COVID time, okay? That we were inundated with emergency waiver requests, as I'm sure many of you know, when everything happened when COVID, and still to this day. You also have to acknowledge in the emergency waiver that the prevailing wage still applies, that bonding requirements still apply, and that DCAM certification still applies. We cannot waive any of those. They all apply always. We have a website now. You just, an email, a special email account, emergencywaivers.dcam@mass.gov. It's right there. You're going to send a letter and you can contact us. Now, if you're not quite ready to write the letter because something happened, but you don't know you don't know the scope yet, you don't have an estimated price yet. I think I said that along the way. You're supposed to give us, yes, the approximate dollar value of the emergency scope. It's there, I just didn't mention it. So if you're not quite there yet, but you're not sure, you've got one coming and you need some advice about how to proceed, you can always contact us. There are 4 names there. I'm one of us. One of them, you can email us. You can also call us, but during times of COVID, you might not have our phone numbers. So email's often a way. So if you have an actual emergency waiver, send it to the emergency waiver database. If you've worked with one of us before and you want to bounce something off of us, you can contact us. If you'll know our emails, hopefully, and some of you probably already have my phone numbers. So that's that. Prevailing wage and bonding. So as I'm sure you all know, the prevailing wage law in Massachusetts requires that every single worker on any construction project, vertical or horizontal, must be paid the prevailing wage. The Department of Labor Standards issues prevailing wage rates on a project-by-project basis. Again, if it's a $1 project, you need to pay the prevailing wage, you need to get rates. Now, I'm sure what some of you do is you may get annual rates for the small stuff. We do that. We'll get annual rates for, say, projects under $50,000 that have the full rates, for, Metro Boston, Central Mass, Western Mass, whatever. But for your town, you can get rates for little stuff. And that way, every time you're calling someone, you don't have to get the rates, but anything. And you should call DLS and talk with them about how you might get those sort of what I'll call small project rates. But the rates must be provided in any contract documents or bids that you're doing. It's required to be paid on all projects to all workers that work on site only, not folks working maybe in a fabrication plant in another part of the state or another part of the country. You're required to get those rates. You're required to include them in the contracts and provide them to the contractors. You're also required to make sure they're posted on your construction site. And your last important job that lasts the longest, in essence, is that you need to make sure, or your owner's project manager needs to make sure that every single contractor and subcontractor that is working on site on a weekly basis is submitting certified payroll reports, evidencing that every worker, John was on the site Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Susie was on the site on Tuesday through Friday, and how many hours they worked, et cetera, that those are being submitted as required by law. And any of you that have been involved in construction projects probably know that from time to time you will get public records requests for them. It is your responsibility to make sure they're being submitted and that they get submitted to you. Okay. The prevailing wage law used to be you got a set of rates that were good for the life of the project. In 2008, it got changed. Now, if you have a multi-year project, each year on the anniversary of the date that the contract was signed, I believe, you have to get new rates from the Department of Labor Standards and provide those new rates to the contractor, who must post those new rates on the website, on the project site, provide those new rates to all the subcontractors, and et cetera. The rates get updated. Acts as an opportunity, a very hot topic of recent. I was at the Ken Wertz's group, the facilities administrators group. I was at that conference on Wednesday, and there was a whole segment on particularly workforce participation, but I'll give you a little history of these programs and when you need to know about them. So these programs have been around. I'm gonna pause for a second. These programs have been around since the Dukakis administration, for those of you that were around back then. So we're talking the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a big push across the country to make sure that, and for some reason, construction, it was focused on construction. So to make sure that federal and state and local construction projects had minority businesses working on it, and it started as minority business programs. So the first executive order from Governor Dukakis was an executive order for construction only and for minority businesses only. And those were the early programs, and then expanded to include minority and women businesses, and then it expanded to include not only just construction, but construction and design. And these are programs that are intended to make sure that minority-owned and women-owned firms get a share of public work, because based on discriminatory practices, especially in the construction industry, minority and women-owned firms were not getting their fair share of work, or were not even getting the resources that non-minority and non-women-owned firms had in order to be successful businesses in a very competitive market. And what folks think about these programs, for the most part, the visible part of these programs are goals. But affirmative marketing programs don't just have goals. They actually involve both race and gender neutral programs and race focused programs. So goals are focused on race and gender, right? So many % women, so many % minority owned businesses. Race neutral are programs that impact all businesses, small businesses alike, majority-owned small businesses, and they're not specific. So every program that you'll see has both of those. The reason these programs, when they first came out in the 80s, a lot of these programs, there was no basis to decide what's the right amount of minority business participation and what's the right amount of women business participation. So you'd see some cities in particular would say, hey, we've got 30% minorities in our city, so we're going to make a 35% MBE goal so that they can get their fair share plus. There were some major Supreme Court challenges to the early affirmative marketing programs, and those programs are struck down time and time again. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court set forth some very stringent requirements to have these programs. So in order for any entity to have a program, they have to show that there has been a history of and still a persistent existence of discrimination against these businesses in the area where the program is going to be put in place. And then if you're going to set goals, participation goals, they must be based not on the population, not on what you think they should be able to get, but on the available pool of minority and women businesses in that area of the country in those trades. And thus became the requirement that if you want to have one of these programs, you have to do something called a disparity study. You have to study what's going on in discrimination in the Massachusetts construction marketplace. What's gone on, what is the availability of minority and women businesses in the construction trades, in the design trades. So that's just a little background. And to this day, there are challenges to these programs. So they have to be administered, they have to be developed and administered, keeping in mind that there are legal parameters on what these programs can and cannot do. So DCAM has had a program in place since the 1980s. When those US Supreme Court cases came out, we did our first disparity study in 1996, because the 1995 was one of those big Supreme Court decisions. We did our first disparity study in 1996. And since then, we've done two more. We did one in 2010 and one in 2017. And we are going to probably undertake a new one in the next year or two. So again, we have to keep up with what's the current state of the market here and make sure our program is defensible if it gets legally challenged. Again, even some of the, when COVID came, when some of those federal funds first came out and were being targeted to minority businesses, the federal monies, there were legal challenges to those programs. Even today, these programs are challenged. And so it's very important to, if you're going to have a program, if you're going to put goals in a project, you need to do it within the parameters of what the legal requirements are. So in July 2020, we rolled out our most recent version of the affirmative marketing program in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, the law is set forth in Chapter 7C. I'm flipping them in a bit. Chapter 7C, Section 6 has the affirmative marketing program law, and there are also a couple of executive orders that address it. I'm going to flip back in a minute and I'll come back here. But we rolled out our new program in July of 2020. We went to 2 sets of goals. So we have DCAM as an overall annual spending goal. So across all of our projects, our full portfolio of projects, we have a fairly aggressive goal of 8.8% and for women, 4.2% minority in construction, and 15% for women, and 6.6% in design for construction. These are goals that never, ever, ever will appear on a particular project. These are a goal that we aspire to meet across our almost $1 billion of spending a year. What the new project, the new program rolled out, which is new for anyone that's done this before, is that we are doing project-specific goal setting. It's not one size fits all. You're not going to put 10.4 on all your projects. You've got to do, and we are doing project-specific goal setting, both on the construction projects and the design projects. We take the data from our disparity study that tells us what are the actual availabilities in in our state on a project that's say 80% HVAC and 20% other trades. So we're going to take that project and they're going to look at the availability for 80% of the dollars and the availability for 20% of the dollars, if that makes sense to you. So we do that, and then we apply some other factors, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But do not really, if you didn't know this on July 1st, you know it now, and your OPMs hopefully know it, is you can't just make up a goal or use an old goal and put it in a project. We also split up MBE WB, so you will need a separate MBE goal for each of these contracts and a separate WBE goal. Okay, this program applies to all state agency buildings and certainly DCAMs, and it applies to state-funded or state-assisted building projects. So that's any project that you have that has state funds in it. You are required to put MBE and WB goals in your design project procurements and in your construction procurements. DCAM and the individual state agencies track our own programs. You are required to track your program, and you're required to report that tracking to the Supplier Diversity Office. That's under Chapter 7C. That's under the law. Okay, I'm not making this up. So the overall annual goals are set by DCAM and SDOR. The overall goal that I showed you on this slide here, these percentages, 4.2, 8.8, those were set by SDO and DCAM combined. But for your individual projects, you are going to be setting individual goals for each of the state-assisted projects that you have undertaken. There are also workforce participation goals. They are 15.3% for minorities and 6.9% for women. They were set in ANF Bulletin 14, which is, well, I got to change this. This says executive order. It's actually ANF Bulletin 14 set these, and those ANF Bulletin 14 not only tells you what the goals are, these are mandatory. They cannot be waived. They cannot be adjusted downward. They're mandatory goals. They must be in any state-funded project. And ANF Bulletin 14 has language you can put in your contract. So you can literally cut and paste the language out of ANF 14, put it into your procurement documents, put it into your contract or your general conditions. So it explains how the workforce program works. These, when they were set, are not goals that must be met. These were set as what I'll call aspirational goals. That is, the Commonwealth wanted to track the participation of minorities and women on their projects to see where they were and whether they were greater than or less than these numbers. So these are not a floor, or they're not a ceiling. These are just, if you will, benchmarks against which they want to see how this partition is changing over time. So with the MBE WB goals, and I didn't get into this, but when we set project-specific goals, not only do we put the information in and compare the availability for the separate trades that are working on it, but you also have to look at project-specific factors. For example, if you have a project on Nantucket or the Vineyard, there's a very small pool of contractors that will come there. So there may be a basis in which to reduce or waive goals on those particular projects. We reduce goals, for example, my perfect example of this, when we re-gilded the gold dome at the State House. There are not a lot of subcontracting opportunities in that. It's a vendor that is highly specific, that gilds outside, surfaces. So we waived the goals on that project. If we have a goal that's a complete HVAC project with very little subcontracting opportunities, we will reduce the goals. So you start with setting the goals based on the dollar allocation, but you look at subcontracting. Are there reduced subcontracting opportunities? Is it a location that's very difficult and it's going to be hard to get anybody to bid? Is it an emergency project where it's got to get done in a week, and something like that? There's got to be factors that support an adjustment downward from the goals, or in some instances waiving them. If you're going to reduce or waive goals, you want to talk to the Supply Diversity Office. By the way, to set your goals, you want to contact the Supply Diversity Office at least 3 weeks before you're planning to advertise your procurement. They will help you. They will ask you for your estimates for the project in order to set the goals, but you need to give them time to do that. So if you have a project that's state funded and it's a building project, you're going to want to get goals. You're going to contact the Supply Diversity Office, tell them about it, provide the information they need, and they will set the goals for you. You can't be an expert at this. That's what we do for the state agencies, and SDO is doing for you. If you also have to have in your contracts the ability for a contractor to request a waiver before the bidding, so that if you're using, hopefully you're using our standard DCAM forms in our instructions to bidders. There's a whole process where a contractor has to submit a request for reduced goals after the filed bids come in, but in plenty of time so that it doesn't delay the bidding. You cannot reduce or waive the goals after the bids have come in. So if someone is requesting a reduction of goals on a project that you've put goals on, you want to call the Supply Diversity Office. You're going to want to look at this. The instructions tell them exactly. They have to submit evidence that they sought firms, they sought MBEs and WBs, and they couldn't find them. So it's a pretty rigorous standard to reduce or waive the goals by a bidder, a potential bidder, but the law requires you to give them that opportunity and to review it. And those of you who know the public bidding laws know that you wouldn't want to grant a reduction or waiver after the bids have come in. If you're going to reduce or waive it, it's going to be reduced or waived for all the bidders. You're going to issue an addendum saying, you know, the goals were originally this and that. We're now reducing them to this and that. And you're going to do it in enough time so that the bidders can incorporate that price change or potential price change in their biddings. Again, if you get one of those, call Supply Diversity Office or call us and we'll help you through that. I'm talking to a town right now that's got an issue with that. And I saw something recently that horrified me. The town didn't know how to get MBE, WBE, MBE, Minority Women Business, and WBE, Women-Owned Business Enterprises are businesses. Minority Women Workforce Goals are the people working on the site with the tools. This town took that 15.3 and 6.9, added that. They took the workforce goals or workforce benchmarks, added them together, and put them in as a combined MBE-WB goal. Yikes, illegal, not defensible, okay? Bad. So please understand these programs, and if you're working with an OPM, hopefully they'll be guiding you on that as well. The current program we have at DCAM, we put goals in the program, we adjust and reduce and waive them when they're appropriate ahead of time. We do not award a contract. This is really important. You don't want to have the plan for bringing on MBs and Ws come in with the bid. You don't want to, so your bids are going to come in. After the bids come in, only after the bids come in, you ask the apparent low bidder to submit their minority and women business plan. And that is what you look at to make sure they're going to meet the goals. If they're not going to meet them, you can't award them the project because that's a required portion of their contract compliance. On occasion, we'll get a contractor who hasn't worked with us before who says, oh, I thought I really can't meet, they're the low bidder. They want to sign the contract with us, but they can't show us their MBW. Oh, I tried, I can't find. I say, too bad. You were supposed to ask for the reduction before the bid. You can't ask now. It would violate the laws. All the other bidders bid with the expectation of meeting the goals. And they say, oh, we can't. And I say, well, sorry, if you can't, you will not be able to, we can't award you the contract. And I will say to you, again, if you're in this situation, you want to contact your legal counsel. But in the 21 years that I've been doing this, every single time the firm that said, I can't, when they realized that they would lose the project, suddenly they could. So I'll leave it at that. Anyway, what we do is we also monitor. So it's not just an obligation to put goals in your project documents to get evidence before you award and sign the contract that they're going to be able to meet the goals, but you have an obligation to monitor. And again, this is your OPM Are those MBEs and WBs working on the site? Are the firms that were supposed to show up to do the work doing the work? And if not, working with the contractor to make things right. Our standard documents have a whole bunch of information on them. If you need some help with monitoring compliance, you can always reach out to our compliance unit. We do training and outreach across the state. We give individualized assistance to small minority, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses who are trying to get certified or trying to understand how to bid public work. We do reporting on, we have an annual report. It's on our website of our MB, WB, and veteran participation, as well as our workforce participation. We've had a workforce reporting program for as long as we've had a MBEW program, over 30 years. Again, the Dukakis administration was the first one that put out workforce goals, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. So this is just an example. Our fiscal year 2021 report is being compiled as we speak, but right now our fiscal year 2020 is out, and you can see that our annual goal, because these are still projects that were bid, the projects we're paying on now were bid before July of 2020. We had a goal of 10.4 for MBEWB. We're at 13% for fiscal year 20. $30 million went to MBEWB firms on our construction projects, and on our design projects, over $10 million. We had a goal of, oh gosh. Anyway, the goal for WBM and WBs on design was in the teens, and we knocked it out of the ballpark this year at 30.2% participation by minority women firms. I need to update this number because this is old, but from 2001 to 2017, we'd already paid $766 million on DCAM projects to M's and W's. If you add 18, 19, 20, and 21, we're well over, you know, I mean, we're into the billions of over $1 billion on DCAM projects through the years. We also have a service disabled and veteran business enterprise program. It's 3% for combined for veteran owned businesses. I'm just quickly going here. There's also a workforce participation law, which has been a surprise to a lot of municipalities, in part because no one ever was really looking at it, but it has come to light recently. So Chapter 7C, Section 6 was amended, and in it, it has language that says the Commonwealth shall include language in all, if you see it here, in all state construction contracts, that's DCAM and other state agencies, but it also says state-assisted construction contracts, setting forth participation goals of minority and women workers to be employed on such contract, and the process for procedures to ensure compliance goals, including reporting and enforcement. Now, if you look at A&F Bulletin 14, it gives you those 15.3 and 6.9% goals. It gives you language about reporting. What we do is at the same time they report their certified payrolls, they report their workforce hours. So when they're doing their certified payroll report and they're putting John's hours in, they on a separate sheet can say John is a minority. And when they're putting Mary's hours in, they put on the sheet, well, Mary is a woman, right? So they're already doing certified payroll on a weekly basis. You can easily add a second sheet to that that includes whether that individual employee is a minority or a woman or neither. And some people have, I've heard someone advocating just changing the payroll report, you know, the one that the Attorney General's, the certified payroll report form, to add more columns. We don't do it that way. We've always done that either separately on paper, though we now have an electronic reporting system because we have so many projects going on out there. And here's the A&F Bulletin I mentioned to you, 15.3, 6.9. Workforce goals are not a subject to waiver, but it says here, right? Goals shall not be construed as quotas or set-asides. Rather, they'll be used to measure the progress of the quality, Commonwealth, or equal opportunity, right? Not a floor or a ceiling for the particular individuals, okay? It has the model contract language, and you should always, always, always consult with legal counsel if you're considering opposing sanctions for MBE, WBE, for workforce, or anything else on your projects. Absolutely. Okay, how are we doing here? Okay, real quick. Compliant specs. This is just general information. The law for public procurement and contracting is that you cannot have a proprietary spec. Every spec for materials, we're talking about materials. So if you're putting windows in a building, you can't say I want Anderson windows and nothing else. You have to provide, your designer, and your OPM should be looking for this, has to provide competitive. So they have to identify 3 different brands of windows that are acceptable for the project, and that has to say the words or other. Okay, the legally compliant procurement of materials has 3 different vendors listed for the materials that are requested for the project, right? You can only request what's called a proprietary spec if you make a written determination that it is important to have a proprietary spec. When we do that, I will tell you, in correctional facilities, if you have a correctional facility and you're redoing a wing of the facility, you want to have the cell locking, the system that locks and opens the cells and locks and opens the doors between the various cell blocks and portions of the building. They have to all speak seamlessly with the rest of the building. So that's an instance where you're going to get a proprietary spec. You're going to want the same system that's in the rest of the correctional facility in the new wing that's being added or renovated. Okay, clearly there's a reason for that. In our courthouses, the courts, they have probation officers, judges, different DAs, right, that are going from court to court to court. They need to have a security pass system so that it works across the courthouses. They get proprietary specs. They use the same system in all their new courthouses, and they build them over, they update. That's the reason for a proprietary spec. A proprietary spec is inappropriate if you like the quality of the product of one vendor over another, or there's a good relationship between your designer and a certain company. That is not a basis for a proprietary spec. So that's just a little bit about that. Alternates, sometimes folks build alternates and have no understanding what they're getting into. If you want to do alternates, if you put them in the bid documents, first of all, firms that are bidding that project have to have single project limits and aggregate project limits that are higher, because they're going to add the value of those alternates into the value of the project to see if they meet this single project and aggregate project limits. Number 2, when you have alternates, you must have them in order. So you can't take alternate 2 or 3 unless you take alternate 1. So alternate 1 must be accepted, and then only can you take alternate 2 if you choose, and alternate 1 and 2 must be selected then if you want to take alternate 3. When I see projects with alternates for items that are like $100,000 or something, I think it's crazy. You can always do a change order and negotiate it. Putting alternates in bids, also sometimes the bidders screw up and either forget to complete the alternate or something like that, and then you've lost a low bidder. So be very mindful. It's generally speaking not a good process to load a bunch of, I saw a project once, they had like 8 alternates. I'm like, are you crazy? Don't you know what you're bidding? And it just causes all kinds of bid protests, bid errors, and a mess. Okay, and then I've literally seen that where the low bidder that everybody wanted to hire, right, they didn't have a single project limit because the alternate, even if you don't accept it, they have to have the single project limit as if you're going to accept it. So those are things to keep in mind when you're dealing with alternates. And again, I mentioned this earlier, you must in the specs designate out in separate sections what is the work of those 18 files of bid trades, and when it is customary in those trades that other subcontractors do the work, those must be spelled out as well. Like they're called paragraph E subcontractors. They're called that because it appears in paragraph E of the law. See 2E, see the mention there, 2E, paragraph E. So again, your designers and your OPM should be looking at that, but it's always important to be somewhat literate in these things so that you can know what folks are talking about. I'm done. Important resources, our website, information on contractor certification, sample design and construction documents, information on emergency waivers, pre-qual, and affirmative marketing program, the all-important website at the CCAPPO training and the IG's handbooks and other publications, And as always, the Attorney General's website's got prevailing wage information. It's got public bidding information, OSA 10. Lots of what you want is going to be found on these 3 websites. Ta-da! Any questions from anybody who's still awake?
Thank you so much, Susan. All right, let's see. I'm sure most people are starving at the moment, so they're definitely not sleeping. Anybody have any questions for Susan? No? Worst
Okay.
case scenario, they all have your contact info, so I'm sure.
Yes.
Is there any way that you can send over that presentation so that I can make it available to our members?
I prefer that you not post it on a website and just
Okay.
provide it that so anyone on this call who wants to request it, that only those folks get it. We don't like, people look at this stuff and then not having heard the presentation,
Yep.
You can take the words and do all kinds of stuff. So we don't want them sitting on anybody's website, but if anyone wants them, you can certainly provide it. My
Sure.
phone number.
I'll email it to them. All
Sure.
right.
My number is 617-620-2783. 617-620-2783. And my email is susan.goldfischer. It's spelled GOLDFISCHER @mass.gov. And I'm always available to help with questions. And if I can't answer the question, I can probably send you to someone who can. Thank you so much for your patience listening to this.
No
You're
worries.
experts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So there's no excuse now. No protests coming.
It's a major brain dump. So trust me, it's not expected that everybody's going to remember it all. Let me share for a moment. There we go. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one. If
Okay.
everybody else could stay on, I'm just going to quickly go through the remaining items on the agenda. If I haven't completely lost you all. All right. Everyone's still awake? All right. So I figured since I'm still recording and this way I can share it with folks. So just going through the agenda quickly, I did skip over the approval of the meeting minutes from the last CCAPPO meeting in September. They weren't ready in time for today, so we're going to have it tabled to the next meeting. So just wanted to do a quick announcement on that. For D, county bid update. So I wanted to give you a quick update on the current bids that I'm working on for the countywide procurements. So as of right now, I am waiting for information from the towns for the bids that I'm working on. So the golf materials, I just extended that out to December 15th. So any of your golf superintendents that have bids for golf materials, that's due from the towns on the 15th on their quantities. Porta-Johns is due right after the holiday, so due Monday the 29th. So any towns that participate in that bid for the Porta-Johns, I've already met with most of them that have participated in the past. So that information will be due on the 29th. And then finally, we have the roadway bids. We have 2 bids that are going out this year for the roadways. One is the construction items and roadway materials. That's quite a big one. And then the second one is the road resurfacing projects. So as of right now, the Chapter 90 form, so any of the projects or items, either bid, that's going to be reimbursable by Chapter 90. We do need to collect pre-qual forms if any of that is going to be over 50,000. I've already met with most of your DPW directors, so if this doesn't apply to you, don't worry. But for them, these sheets are due on the 30th to me. And then the if you do have a resurfacing project, those project request forms also have to be submitted to Mass DOT through their portal. It's only for the projects, not for the construction items and materials. As a cooperative bid, we're exempt from that, so we just have to do the pre-qualification and not the project request. So the trades is the other one that I'm going to be working on this fall/winter. And that one, unfortunately, I haven't been able to start yet, but it's really just an ongoing bid to get additional trade vendors onto our county contract. The ARPA procurement. So I was on LinkedIn the other day. I hadn't seen the Inspector General share this through a bulletin or anything like that. So I wanted to make sure that everybody, especially since we're, most of the towns have received some sort of ARPA funding, that you were aware that there's a link from the Inspector General's office with some resources. So I did want to go ahead and share that. If you already know about it, already have it, great. But I figured it would definitely help to have this information too. So that way, because it is federal funds, regardless of the source, you still have to abide by, the state procurement laws. If there's some sort of construction, because it's federal funding, Davis-Bacon would apply. And of course, as we kind of saw today, if you're ever in doubt of when it'll apply or what you need to do, or if it's 30B and whatnot, there's always the 30B hotline, or you can always call me. But I figured I wanted to share that link with everybody because I know that's going to be something that's going to be coming up as everybody starts to spend that funding. And quickly, so there was recently a MAPPO meeting where they clarified, or I guess are now officially enforcing, the continuing educational credits. So attending, being a part of CCAPPO, everybody is entitled to continuing education credits towards your MCPPO recertification. So I went back to one of Elaine's old files, and you are allowed 2 credits per year, but only once in a 3-year cycle. So I guess some of us, myself included, got away with being able to put in the 2 credits per year. You're only allowed basically 2 credits in a 3-year cycle. So I guess a lot of MAPPO members weren't too thrilled about that, but it was a clarification, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody here was aware, because I know from time to time we do get asked, or I do get asked for attendance, which is usually posted on the meeting minutes on the website. So that way you can submit that with your recertification. And I think that's it for my part. I figured everyone's probably hungry. I don't know if you have any questions, comments. No. Tom, did you want to ask that question about the roadway bids? Feel free.
It's a little tedious, so I don't know if the whole group cares or not.
You never know.
All right, so it's slightly complicated. Okay, so under the materials bid,
Yes.
okay, there is not an item for partial pavement patch. Okay, that is an item usually listed on the road specific projects. Okay, so what I did last year a little bit, because I didn't have a patch and bid, whatever, I put in, and I'm going to do it again this year. What I'll do is I will put in, like say for this year, I'll have 8 streets, and the only item is partial pavement patch for each one of those streets.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and then what I do later is I just come back later with my chip seal bid and I go over it and I'm done. Okay. So my question is I got a couple of those streets of the 8 streets, 2 of them each are over $50,000. Okay. So I'm going to put in a pre-qual for those 2 streets.
Okay.
All right. Now in your email, I'm just trying to be cognizant of paperwork for everybody. In your email, you say, don't put it in if it's not chapter 90 or if it's below a threshold. All right, so I try to be cognizant of that. So if I get 2 streets, I'm going to put in 2 pre-quals for those 2 streets. But I have all these other streets, these other 6 streets that might be 40,000 each, whatever, but they're under the 50. Do I put in the paperwork for those? Because I was looking at how you awarded previously the street specific.
Yep, it's by.
And it looks like it's all lumped together, or are they awarded separately?
It is awarded by project. So
okay, all right. So I only had one.
It is awarded by street. So you would have to do one for each street, and it's only if it's reimbursable by chapter 90. So if you have 8 streets and only 2 of them are are going to be reimbursed by Chapter 90, then you only have to do those two.
All right,
If
so it's going to be reimbursed by chapter, potentially, because I haven't actually made those decisions yet on exactly how I'm going to cut it up. So potentially any one of those streets could be. So I should put in a pre-qual,
Yes.
even
Just
if it's only, even if it's under 50,000.
No.
Okay.
If it's over 50,000,
Okay.
because we award by project, or in
Right.
this case by street. Each street is an individual project because that's a whole road resurfacing project.
Yeah.
So if that total amount is going to be over 50,000, then you have to do the pre-qual for it.
Right.
If it's going to be 20, 30, then no, don't do it.
Okay.
It's
All
not
right.
bad.
I think I got it.
All right. That's not
Just trying to
bad.
save paperwork
That's
and all that.
exactly. That's a good clarification question though, because I'm sure others will have it too. So no worries.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
No problem. Any other questions from anyone? No. All right. Well, it's 12:32. I would ask for a motion to adjourn, but I don't know if anybody's still out there. I see quite a few people on the call, but I don't know if there's.
I'll put forward a motion to adjourn, Jen.
Thanks,
I
Amber.
second the motion.
To another meeting. Thanks, Greg. All right, guys. You guys have have a great day, great afternoon, and I'll be sending this recording out as soon as I can. All right. Have a good one.
Thank you as well, Jen.
Anytime.
Thanks. Have a good holiday.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Happy Thanksgiving.